an interracial married couple. She was Black, he was Pacific Islander. They were in their late 30s, married for almost a decade. By the time they came to us for a couples therapy intensive, they had no problem describing their positions and how the fights went. By that point, they'd done it hundreds of times. There was no dissent between the two of them about what their fights were about. According to them, they were fighting about gift giving and money. They were both clearly in agreement on that. The problem was, they never seemed to be able to fix it. The solutions they came up with never stuck. They relentlessly found themselves, once again, back in the same contentious debate, like some kind of Twilight Zone. Here's how it always went. Shanae deeply wanted Manuel to be more spontaneous, especially surrounding gifts. He rarely showed his appreciation for her in a tangible way, and she felt strongly that he should surprise her once in a while with a token of his affection. This is what people in relationships did. But she had trouble expressing that to him. Instead of bringing it up directly, she'd try surprising Manuel with a gift to model the kind of dynamic she hoped they could have, but he would get upset. "What are you thinking, spending money on this junk? We can't afford this." Manuel, for his part, was frustrated. They were on a tight budget. Money had always been a source of stress for them. In fact, a few years prior, they'd been forced to file for bankruptcy. They had made a clear plan to be more financially responsible and avoid the same thing happening again. And this kind of extra, unnecessary gifting would push them right off the responsible track they'd worked so hard to get into. They came up with various agreements to solve this conflict. For instance, they would do gift giving only on major holidays, or they would stick to a price limit for gifts. All the agreements backfired for one reason or another. One Valentine's Day, Manuel presented Shanae with a large, beautifully wrapped box. Thrilled, she tore the wrapping off and found a new blender. He noted her disappointment, but she said nothing. She thanked him flatly and went back to unpacking her lunch bag from work and cleaning the containers. Manuel was upset. He'd followed the rules they'd agreed on. Today was a holiday. He'd gone right up to the price limit. This was a fancy blender, one she'd been wanting, and he hadn't forgotten. He'd done everything right, and she was still not satisfied. What would it take, he wondered. Did he have to drain their bank account to make her happy? Build her the Taj Mahal? He followed her as she moved around the kitchen. "What's the problem?" he demanded, raising his voice. "Shanae? What's wrong? You constantly say you want gifts, and I got you a gift. I spent a lot of money on that, you know." "I know," she said, already on the verge of tears. "It's nice." It was nice, of course, but it wasn't a gift. It was just something they needed. But if she criticized it, she knew he'd blow up. "Nice? So what's the matter with it, What exactly was I supposed to get you instead? There's always so many secret rules with you. I can never win." "Don't yell at me." "I'm not yelling." He was yelling. Shanae turned and left the room, locked herself in the bathroom, and cried. So, first, Shanae and Manuel are great examples of people with very different conflict styles. He was volatile, while she was avoidant. She avoided bringing up the problem overtly, trying to model the behavior she wished for instead. When they finally did address it, he'd blow up. When we met with them, Shanae said her husband clearly didn't care about her as much as he cared about money. Meanwhile, Manuel told us that his wife didn't care about their future or the amount of financial stress he was under. And they had run out of hope that they would solve this conflict, which seemed to be rearing its head over and over and causing nastier and nastier fights. After their last one, Shanae had gone to bed in tears. Manuel, unable to come down from the intense physiological flooding he experienced during their fights, had been up half the night, pacing the house. They came to see us as a last resort. They both wanted to know, how do we get past this? When couples get stuck in cyclical, gridlocked conflict where there is no progress, it's generally a sign that instead of moving on from it, they actually need to pause, slow down, and go deeper. When we fight, we often try to fix a problem before we understand it. We get stuck in a superficial argument instead of digging down to the deeper source of the conflict. We push toward a solution or resolution before we've actually understood our partner's position and what's beneath it. It's not always easy to see the real cause of conflict. As we see here with Manuel and Shanae, we can quite literally spend years having the same fight again and still not know what's truly fueling it. Manuel and Shanae didn't need to come up with a solution to the surface problem they had surrounding gifts. They'd already tried that. They needed to stop right there, in that hot point of friction between them, and dive down. Signs you need to go deeper. Observing couples in the Love Lab, we initially assumed there would be certain content areas that couples tended to get gridlocked about. Well, there weren't. People could get gridlocked over anything at all. As we discussed earlier in What We Fight About, we quickly saw that couples could be in cyclical gridlock over every issue under the sun, including the most trivial-seeming topics. Who's going to control the remote? What temperature do we set the thermostat at in winter? Are the kids allowed to have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for dinner if they don't like what we made? There were no categories, and that's because any point of conflict between two people, no matter how large or small, can have all kinds of stuff under the surface. Our conflicts, in that way, are a little bit like icebergs. Sometimes we're only seeing the tippy top. We have no idea yet how far down this obstacle goes or how big it is until we crash right into it. Now, we also know that the majority of our conflicts are perpetual, that we will have to manage them over the course of our lives, and that they may never be solved once and for all. So what's the difference between managing perpetual conflict and gridlock? The answer is, it feels very different. You may come back to a particular topic over and over again throughout your lives together. That doesn't mean you're in gridlock. That means you have a difference between you in personality or lifestyle preference. You simply need to learn how to dialogue calmly and constructively with one another when your differences come up. The strategies you've learned so far will definitely be helpful here. Gridlock is different. Gridlock feels bad, really bad. You're in gridlock if your conflicts over this topic leave you feeling rejected by your partner. You talk and talk about this issue and make zero progress. There's no movement at all toward a solution or compromise. Every time you discuss this issue, you feel worse afterward. Your continued conflicts over this issue are causing hurt and emotional damage to one or both of you. When they came to us, Manuel and Shanae were in gridlock over giving gifts. They were experiencing all of the classic signs we just talked about. They felt terrible after their fights. Their attempts at compromise and problem solving had failed. They were getting more and more frustrated with each other and more predisposed to assume the worst. At that point, they were both experiencing negative sentiment override, which we also call the negative perspective. It basically means that we've been fighting cyclically so much, we're unable to view our partner's words and actions any way but negatively, even if that's not how they were intended. We stop giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Instead, we assume the worst. If we ask our partner a question and they don't respond, instead of thinking, oh, he didn't hear me, we think, ignoring me again, as always. Even neutral situations will be perceived as negative. When we get caught in gridlock, it's hard to stay out of the negative perspective. Gridlock is a big sign you need to go deeper. It's like a flashing alarm light indicating that it's time to uncover what's really fueling this conflict. But even if you're not yet gridlocked on something, There are other signs that you and your partner need to pump the brakes on this fight and figure out what you're really fighting about before you try to proceed. Signs you need to slow your fight down. You're stumbling over something seemingly trivial. You're thinking, why are we fighting about this minor thing? You have actually arrived at compromise, but then it gets undermined by one or both of you. You can't stick to it. The same topic keeps popping up in other fights or conversations like an uninvited guest. Or it's the reverse. You avoid a particular topic like the plague. It's becoming a kind of elephant in the room that both of you skirt around. Your partner has a surprising, outsized seeming reaction to a discussion that comes out of nowhere and takes you off guard. That last one can be a big tell. You think you're having a routine logistical conversation and your partner has a big emotional reaction that seems to come out of nowhere. If you get a response that doesn't make sense to you, say they get flooded or angry over something you thought would be a mundane, unremarkable planning conversation about the calendar or plans for the weekend, that's a clear sign that something's up. You just crashed into an iceberg, something lurking under the surface that you didn't see. So what do? You spool down your engines and slow way down. Say, let's back up. Looks like this might be a deeper issue than I thought. When we were first married, we had an incident like this one. John was arriving home from work, and Julie was already home, starting dinner in the kitchen. As John walked in the door, he spotted the mail sitting on the foyer table, and it reminded him that we'd had a plumber out a couple of weeks ago, and John couldn't remember if we'd paid the bill. He strolled into the kitchen and said, "Hey, did you pay the plumber?" Julie dropped the knife she was using to slice onions and whirled around. "I don't know," she snapped back. "Did you pay the plumber?" She stomped into the bedroom and slammed the door. Hard. John stood there with the mail in his hand thinking, did I marry a lunatic? He marched into the bedroom and confronted her. "What on earth is the matter with you? I just wanted to know if you paid the plumber." "Oh, right," she said. "I'm just the secretary around here. You don't even say hello first. You just move right to the checklist that I'm supposed to complete. Well, I didn't, so I'm bad." John was baffled and defensive, and the conversation didn't go particularly well at first. But finally, we both calmed down. John sat down on the bed and asked Julie more gently now, "Where is this coming from?" Julie thought about it for a while and finally was able to explain. "When I was a kid growing up," she said, "I'd come home and my mother would always have some criticism for me, like, 'Is that what you wore to school? Well, you look fat in it.' When you came in just now, you sounded exactly like her." Julie's request, in the end, was actually fairly simple. "When I first see you at the end of the day, I really need you to come kiss me and say hello and ask how the day was. Then you can ask me if I paid the plumber." We arrived at it because we took a bit of time to go deeper, ask questions, figure out why something that seemed small caused such a big reaction. Reactions like that are a red flag planted in the ground saying, "Dig here," and asking for your care and attention. If you're seeing any of the signs that you need to go deeper into an issue, we have a blueprint for that. It's called Dreams Within Conflict. Unlocking your fight. Dreams within conflict. The story behind this particular intervention is a personal one. This method didn't originate in the Love Lab, though we thoroughly tested it there. It came from our own life and relationship. Very early in our marriage, before we created our marriage theory and interventions, we were trying to solve a gridlocked problem, and we weren't getting anywhere. The problem in a nutshell. We were living in Seattle, a busy city. John loved it. Julie didn't. John had grown up in New York City, and to him, the streams of people, the rush of traffic, the noise and bustle of a city were all familiar and comforting. the sensory experience of home. For Julie, who'd grown up in Portland in a house on the edge of one of the biggest wild urban forests in the country, wilderness was home. She sought out the calm and silence of trees. She often sneaked out of her house to sleep in the forest, returning before dawn the next morning. Her parents never knew. Deep, raw nature is what kept her sane. One weekend, we rented a little cabin up on Orcas Island in the upper northwest corner of Washington State, a long drive and ferry ride away from the city. Julie immediately fell in love with Orcas. She had always envisioned someday having a little cabin in the forest somewhere, and after we returned to the island over and over again, scrambling for rentals each time, she realized this was the magic spot for her. So one day, she brought it up to John. "I really want to buy a cabin on Orcas," she said. "What?" John replied, startled. "Absolutely not." And just like that, we were off and running. The fight escalated. We both retreated, angry and dissatisfied. And we kept fighting about it, over and over, for 6 years. Julie couldn't let it go, that treasured vision of the cabin in the woods. And John could not get to yes. The whole idea of buying a place up there seemed extravagant and unnecessary. He stood his ground, she stood her ground. We were gridlocked. It became a pretty big deal in the relationship, an obstacle that swelled bigger and bigger every day that we couldn't help but trip over constantly. Resentment over the issue was leaking into other conversations and seeping into our day-to-day interactions. Negativity was taking over. So we went to a couples therapist. Yes, couples therapists need couples therapists too. This therapist, referred to us by a friend, really liked John. She found him brilliant, talkative, and charming. She was on his side, and it showed up in therapy. Julie receded into the background. One day, as we sat in her office arguing, trying yet again to find a way forward out of our gridlock, she said, "You know, John, you have every right to just say no, and she has to accept it. You can create boundaries. Good relationships are all about boundaries. Just say no." Afterward, we walked out to the car together in silence. John was obviously going over the session in his mind. He was